All right. I thought I'd start with who I am. Who am I? I'm a Sklar. I'm a technologist, like probably you all are, and I've had probably almost 2 decades of experience in tech. I don't want to tell you too much of that. That's probably boring and not as exciting. Um, I like to solve technical challenges, and for most of my career, I've been doing that. And then for a while, I thought, hmm, I wonder if I'm doing a lot of good things, but am I doing the right things? And that kind of steered me to doing more strategic, thoughtful leadership. And like, how am I, before I go solve it on a tactical level, I need to understand what's driving those initiatives and those ideas. And being in security, I've been wearing multiple hats at different capacities to different sizes of industries, different types of industries, and maturity levels, and a lot of transformational types of programs to some steady state ones as well. And I like to tinker with all kinds of things. I like to do a lot of DIYs, house building activities, HVAC, car modifications, welding, fabrication, all that sorts of things. It's fun and extra and keeps my mind going. So that's a little bit about me. Okay. So this talk today is, I would say, more of a combination of uh, the journey of a security leader getting to a point of understanding how to drive initiatives, be successful, a little bit of therapy and coping skills, a little bit of risk management, and having your tool belt items to prepare you for success. And I also love to have back and forth banter. I'll try to, hopefully I don't have to call on anyone. Everyone just raise their hand. If anyone is like, oh, what about this? What about that? Please do. Um, all right. So I'm going to start with something that sounds kind of silly. And I don't want to be the person who just have definitions and what certifications you have. That's not as exciting. I think if you go to any security professional today and you ask them, what is cybersecurity? What does the word secure really mean to them? You get different answers. Anyone will volunteer how to define cybersecurity?
The never-ending story.
Yes. Yes, it's always a journey, right? Go ahead.
I would have said IT with common sense.
Yeah, there's definitely a component because a lot of tech is involved with it for sure. Yeah, I like it. So
So that was what is the definition?
how do you define cybersecurity? And so you have different people that have different explanations to how do you know come up with an idea and define that word.
Yeah.
So my thing of like, how do you condense it down more? And the understanding, managing, mitigating the risk of the critical data, because most of cybersecurity is related to the critical data that's tied to whatever tech you have. And with that, it's like uh, we want to avoid or reduce disclosing the critical data. We don't want to alter the data without having some sort of integrity, and we want to deny data that we think is confidential in your organization. So that kind of hones it into that. I don't know if that makes sense or you all agree to that. It's an interesting way of putting it and condensing it down. And then to kind of combat that was the word secure. Now, a lot of security professionals, they'll come into an organization and like, we hired you to just secure the environment. Like, what does that really mean? And a lot of people have different explanations to what secure means. Does that mean hardening something? Does that mean putting controls in place from a cybersecurity perspective? What does that really mean? So, how I view it is having visibility on something, whatever may be an asset, tech, software, and have an action to, if you have an issue with it, or let's say it gets compromised, whatever it may be, you want to reduce the frequency and impact. And it looks like I have this typo there. It's awesome. The impact, two typos, when incidents occur. So we want to reduce that when something happens, an incident comes in, and you're like, well, my job is just to minimize that, and I'll close out the blast radius per se as much as possible. That's what I'm hired to do. That's how I think cybersecurity folks are hired to do as one of their main job roles. Um, and then risk management. I'm going to spend a lot of time in risk management and just risk in general, because I think that's where a lot of we're playing this balance of, allowing the business, allowing others to enable them, and then where's that balance, and how do you balance that? And I'll talk about it in a couple of different slides as well. So this is again kind of like going back to visibility and action, but uncertainties, and how do you document those uncertainties you have? Most of those uncertainties are negative, usually because you have a risk. It's usually associated with a negative event of sorts, or something you don't want to happen. And then you have something called like a threat and vulnerability. And the easiest analogy I can explain to threat and vulnerabilities, the difference is, let's say since San Diego seems to have a lot of flies in recent times, and let's say you have a front door that has a screen door, and you have like a little gap in the top of that door. So a fly could come in, but maybe it's not. So the vulnerability is that gap. The fly around is the threat coming in, is one way to put it. So now that we have definitions, we can move on. Okay, so under the assumption that you're hired to come in as a security leader or someone just to evaluate a program, if you have one or not, is you need to understand what's going on in the environment and seeking to understand that. So starting with like planning, you might be involved with roadmaps tied to initiatives or projects that you have in the organization. And has anyone thought about like how and why do those things land on that roadmap that you need to execute on or get across the line? Did that ever come a thought of like, is it someone shooting from the hip or just guessing? I think we'd like that because so and so said so. Or is it something that's more data driven? Anyone?
Executive kind of decision for the higher ups.
Yeah. That's one aspect of it. And it's like I always kind of just ask the questions of why. And I want to understand that. And that's kind of like going back to like my DIY abilities of understanding the unknowns and like why do you land on that? Just wanting to understand. And a piece of that is the technology. So if you're going into an environment, either it's new or not, a lot of organizations are over teched. There's so much tools at our disposal, even like in a small startup, even Series B that are funded 10 to 50 million in revenue. They have a lot of tools. And you're like overwhelmed, like, oh, well, I think we have enough. I mean, we've got coverage, we're doing alerts, we're detecting what bad looks like, we're doing email filter, all these sorts of things. You're like, well, are you doing enough? And are you utilizing that tool or process really well? And I always like to say, are you using 90% of that tool? And if you're not, why aren't you? And are you leaning on your vendor or your technical account manager if you're using a tool? Or is there like some opportunities to consolidate the tools? Is another idea. So I think it's important to think about that and even map it out of like your critical kind of like cyber kill chain or your tools that you have at your disposal, that's your environment, is like you know where you stand on that tool, getting the most value out of it. I know like the business likes to say, how can we reduce the cost? And the technology utilization could be a part of that solution. Like, well, we have overlap on this tool and that tool. Oh, maybe there's an opportunity to condense it down to one tool, as an example. Something to think about as you showcase that, hopefully. And then risk management is when you have risks that come up in your environment, how do you identify them? They just show up when you're doing your day-to-day activities, when you're doing implementation, and then you're like, oh, well, that's not right over here because they shouldn't be doing X, Y, Z. And then what happens with that? information? Where does it go? Does it go in a note? Does it go into a ticketing system? Risk management, you should be documenting that, or someone should be documenting that. And then how do you manage it? Like, who manages it? And what's that process look like? So that's just something to think about as you're assuming you're swooping in, boots on the ground. I need to understand the lay of the land and what's going on in different environments. And then critical functions. So with all applications, business functionalities that you have in an environment, you wonder, like, is that tied to the critical data? If you payroll goes down, is everyone going to work? No, and they want to get paid, right? So that's a critical business function. And you think, well, what are we doing to protect that? So, say an adversary, a hacker, was able to compromise that service, or it's denial serviced, or it's taken down or something. What's the impact of that? Should we be focusing on that? I would think we want to focus on that. And bringing back the word secured of managing it, hardening it, containing the blast radius, all these sorts of factors, it should be a focus. So asking that question is another angle to look at it, to know, are we doing the right things, or the good things? And then crisis planning and simulation. So abbreviations BCP, business continuity planning, or disaster recovery planning, or incident response planning. So let's touch on business BCP or DRP for a minute. So if you look at those documents that you have in your organization, you'll notice that usually you'll have like top like functionalities or tier one vendors or services of sorts. What are we doing to protect those? That should be top of your list if you have that. If you're not, I would start documenting and creating that. So, you know, okay, as one of my top items I should be doing to secure the environment or protect the organization is those top business services and functionalities. And then the incident response process, like, well, when incidents happen, what do we do? Is it documented? Is it got a workflow? Have we done tabletops? Like, we need to, I think you can kind of flesh out some like big gaps in that process, and then doing the tabletop with your team or others and stakeholders, you'd be surprised. Like, we can easily poke holes in the process all day long, and you need to have that in place. And this is another item to like kind of evaluate the readiness of that. And then I know a few of you are probably in compliance and audit of sorts and IT. With compliance and questionnaires, are you managing the auditors? Are you documenting well enough where you're not as concerned about, oh, yeah, we barely passed that audit. I'm a little wishy-washy, but I'm not sure about that. Or you're like, I got this all day, right? I can now focus on other things. And it's interesting when you look at a lot of auditors, like one compliance framework, I don't know if I want to mention, they'll look at your policies and procedures and they'll say, well, you need to prove what you say, what you do. Well, how do you prove that? Well, they look at your policy and say, does it recommend, does it say should we follow this, or to say we will, or do we do this? You know, more affirmative answers. And it's interesting, all the wording schemes and a lot of organizations kind of follow somewhere in those lines. And it kind of makes you wonder, like, well, you're not 100% ready to pass that audit, but you pass it because the auditors, it gives you a little some gray area to that. And you kind of wonder, is this an opportunity for us to improve next year when the audit happens, that we can turn that from like, we recommend or we should, and we actually do this, and we do this at whatever frequency it may be.
Was there a reason you
Mostly because it's always good to have you know, an understanding of where you're, the ones that you attest to, where they're just kind of in vague means. So I'm just saying, kind of like generically speaking. I mean, you can.
No, because I was gonna say, your advice is universal
Mhm.
in every. So.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, just the gamut of just nothing specific, you know, your ISO 27001, your SOC 2 type 2, NIST, your your tax ramp, your FedRAMP, your state, all those different ones. There's ways. It's not really talked about too much. Yep.
I don't disagree with the, what you have up there, but one of the things I think is missing is assessing the situation against what? What's the objective? Is it have zero cyber attacks? I would actually posit it's more along the lines of assessing the current situation to keep the business or organization functioning.
Yes.
What is its goal? But if
Yes.
you don't state that, yeah, I can go crazy on those and never really accomplish anything. So
Yeah.
would that actually be probably the first thing that you want? What is it I'm trying to achieve?
Yeah, you definitely need to tie to the objectives and how the money, the business makes the money and the revenue and the balancing confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and somewhere in the mix of like, well, what is that exactly am I trying to protect? Is it the crown jewels, the critical data? I agree. Good point.
Yeah.
I'm gonna cover that. Both sides. Good.
Go.
I was gonna say, so along that line, risk management seems to be kind of where the business meets the cybersecurity problem, but security bites business transaction. In your experience, where like the who fascinates me. So you could have like your stock analysts making your risk management, which seems entirely irresponsible, or you have CISO making all the risk management decisions, which is equally irresponsible, I think. Where for successful organizations found that balance?
I think you have to understand at the different levels, going back to how does the business make money, and where do you fall in protecting the business, and then you have like this like, oh well, I saw that threat come in from the security analyst perspective, and we need to block that threat, and I made that call. And I think having that process of runbook playbooks helps guide that. Then if it's something that's like you might have other stakeholders involved, and it's like, well, my focus is here and this is what I do. And then you're like, well, who's going to make that call? And this is where you start looking at legal, general counsel, you look at privacy and other aspects depending on what it is. And then hopefully you have a severity matrix of like your critical stuff, your definitions, your examples to like, okay, where does this fall? And if it reaches a certain threshold, I need to talk to so and so. I need to escalate that.
Your risk stuff, I mean, just heard this comment, so I think something for the situation. Your risk assessment can tell you what the value of those assets are.
Yeah.
In whatever regulatory framework you operate. There's regulatory frameworks that need to be input to what you need to find valuable for working in that specific industry, right? But also the risk assessment, to your point, is going to prioritize the assets, what are the most valuable to the company, what are garbage, don't need to be protected per se. And that's gonna flush all that out for you. So
Yeah. Depending on like, let's say it's a low hanging fruit, but if something happens to it and the entire operation, then that's going to bring value, not necessarily monetary value, but the overall value.
That's why not, I know you get a very patient.
Okay.
To address your point, usually or typically risk has two components: severity, impact, and so yes, if the impact is significant, the impact of justice, significant impact of extreme low likelihood, and then the risk matrix changes in this occasion.
It's all right, it's all good. I just want to I've been in organizations where there is a BI, business impact analysis, there's risk matrix, there's a lot of work that goes into.
Yeah.
Where I see the struggle is, hey, you're a tier 3 application. You need a tier 5 to do your job. And the roadblocks are, well, that costs a lot of money, it's going to take a lot of time. So my question is, how do you sell that without an incident creating that sense of urgency?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I try to find any way I can remove the emotions out of the picture and just have agreeance on certain aspects. So going back to, it kind of sounds like you're talking about third-party risk of sorts.
No, internal risk.
Oh, internal, okay,
Third party, of course, as well,
yeah, so,
right? You have SLAs there, but internally.
Oh.
You know, I could think of that in my last game, it was a data warehouse. Right, so downstream, these people needed it to do their job, paychecks, all that stuff. Data warehouse is tier 5. They should be down for a day. Or 3 days even. And supposedly, you know, nobody's gonna be impacted, but if you look at all these business impact analysis documents. All kinds of stuff is gonna be impacted, and the organization just doesn't.
yeah, so at that point,
Real quick, some of the people online are saying that we should use our outdoor voice. Ace has got the microphone up there. Yeah, that was gonna ask you, didn't it?
Oh, my mom's rolling over in a crib.
I'll try to also kind of repeat it or regurgitate it up here too, whenever
Yeah,
possible.
sure, that'd be great.
So we're talking about how do we differentiate between different levels of tiers of the data that
Criticality.
or criticality that are meaningful to someone, but others it means like, well, I don't mind it being down for a day or 3 days or 5 days. You're like, how do you decide that? And my response is, if there's a risk associated with that downtime, say availability, I want to make it available. So that 1 day, 3 days, I would start looking at, well, how much money does that cost us to be down? Like at a high level, you don't have to get very specific. And then you now have a dollar figure roughly to think, okay, is this acceptable that we're down for 1 day, 3 hours, whatever the case is? And then if we're doing a BIA or something, we document that so-and-so said this is acceptable for these timeframes, maybe looking at the SLAs that you have in-house, say, does this meet our SLAs and the criticality of those SLAs? And like, okay, well, the business decided that SLA is reasonable. I mean, are we doing 5 nines or are we, this is like a back office thing? And, you know, where does that line fall? And to kind of CYA, cover yourself, is to document that as such that you had the conversation, even if it's a screenshot, whatever, and says, look, well, you agreed to this. Are you okay with that? That's how it would go.
I think these reputational risks of what yes with monetary, like we saw that interview this week with one of Elon and the X-Pros, the whole space went down, and that's the third time that's happened in 3 months. To him, that's maybe not a that's another we're finding that issue to be, and so it has a lot to do with who's running your company. And do you care about the reputation? Another, maybe Jack Dorsey would have flipped out and found that to be something that's going to kill the strategy or whatever. Big Elon was like that, whatever. I got money to spare, burn, I don't care.
Yeah.
I just feel like infrastructure where like there's people lives of it. I think we need something like a hospital for water treatment, energy, like, you know.
Yeah. And to your point, I mean, that's always the number one, is the safety of personnel. Yes, a lot of people say that, it's not. Paper, according to the discipline, that's should always. Whenever you're asked this question, exams or whatever, that's always the answer you choose.
Right. Right. Yeah. So it's for those online, the comment is around prioritizing what the business wants. If the business decides, let's say the CEO decides to say that it's not important, let's say Elon Musk for some service, a critical service that everyone else thinks is critical, but he may not. He accepted that. And as long as you're informing, you're putting it on a silver platter as much as possible, removing emotions, data metrics, then that's part of the business decision. There's nothing else you could do than inform and provide guidance whenever you can.
Yeah, and a lot of times it's not our decision to make. It's our job to identify it. Absolutely. It's our job to identify it and communicate it so those people can make an educated decision on it. To your point, Dave,
There was a client, not that I should, but where I work, and when the new CISO came in, what she did was she just immediately was able to put a quantifiable financial value and say, if this goes down, this is what's gonna cost us. This is this is the, what we can do to mitigate.
Now, is that just time, or is that an actual physical cost? Like, we're gonna have to bring in a vendor, and they're gonna, just, 20 grand to be on site and, and all that.
Well, you want to,
Could be both.
yeah, you want to take into consideration total cost of ownership.
Yeah.
Because if you say, hey, the box is X, but we don't take Y to what it's gonna take to implement the box. And we get okay for X. We haven't, that's part of our due diligence, to come up with what is like the total cost for it.
To your point with the cost, there's a saying that the fear of loss is greater than the desire of gain. So once you actually know what you and stake to lose, you change your procedures and your strategies.
Yeah. That's, I haven't heard that one before. Can you repeat that one?
The fear of loss is greater than the desire for gain. And
And make sure everybody on mind hears that.
A fear, so you're saying a fear of loss is a desire for gain.
greater
than.
the desire for gain. Once you actually know you're gonna lose, and you start acting more as opposed to knowing what you can gain. Is once you expose people to what actually is gonna be lost because of weak security or whatnot, they will start acting more upon it as opposed to gaining a safe environment of security.
That and taking the subjectiveness out of it and just going back to the metrics, removing emotion wherever we can. Yeah, it's a good one. Well, actually, I do cover some of that. Oh, yes.
Two startups, you talk about the startups organization, so. Number three, how do you see startup organizations to cover or assign the ownership of the BCP, the DRP, the I,
Yes.
the IRs? Because not only startup, but a lot of organizations don't have all the seed names, right? Field. So what does the BCP responsibility land on? The IR.
Yeah. So for those online, the question is around for BCP and DRP and process, who in like say a startup, how do you assign ownership to these things and who would do it? And my answer is RACES. If everyone's familiar with RACES, sometimes not very popular, but hopefully you can show them the way it actually do cover this in a couple of slides. I would say defining who does what and then using hopefully compliancy frameworks that can be like the backstopper, like, oh, they require, roles and responsibilities across the organization, and can use that like, well, according to this compliance framework, you need that. So we need to put it together. So everyone has to work together and try to.
Who's responsible for it? Because not everybody's gonna say like, oh, I want
Right.
to do the rest.
Right.
So is it who? And then sometimes they don't even have an IS department, right? Or there is no compliance or audit department. Who in those organizations could be the ultimate for getting those? Yeah.
So as far as who could be responsible for that, I would look at the person who's managing the tech, who's doing the cloud or as if it's on site infrastructure, who's mostly the technologist out of them all.
So then like IT operations is responsible for the servers. Are you talking about silos or everybody's gonna be responsible of the only the island?
I think it's a combination. It's a shared responsibility. So it's how the organization is structured. So for example, if you're a startup and you don't really have a security team, you might have a CIO, but not really a CIO, someone who's kind of leading in technology space, or even a CTO. They might have to be taking the accountability and responsibility, kind of both, to manage that until we start fleshing out who it is. I've seen compliance, or I've seen legal even take ownership of that just to get things going until they kind of fill the seats of security or IT or other organizations. Yeah. Good question. Okay. Common pain points I'm sure you all have kind of run into this. So the misconceptions is that, let's say you were interviewing at a company and you brought up like, do you think I can I'm here to avoid or stop breaches. Right? You think that's true?
Yeah, you can make yourself uninteresting.
All right. Yeah, so some misconceptions that others may not have, even to this day, where we keep seeing breaches and the letters in the mail and everything else, is that we're here to stop or prevent the breaches, and we're not. So that's one I commonly still to this day come across. Leadership challenge. So
So correct.
we're to minimize.
Keyword is own. That's incorrect.
Okay, got it. That was it. Okay, so.
Sorry, I should,
We're not only to prevent.
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. You can prevent all.
Yeah.
It's not to prevent.
I
think. So good.
Yes, I think it's something different. I'm reading it as, my job is strictly and to heavily prevent, as opposed to.
Yeah.
As a cybersecurity professional, I do a lot of other things. I have cultural training to do. I have a whole bunch of other things, of which would include prevention. But it's a broad spectrum of duties and responsibilities. That's the way I look at that, to the answer of no, it is not only two. Am I wrong?
No, you're
Misinterpret?
you're on point.
I see that. There's another group that sees it differently and have to see it differently, which is for the rest of the CEO.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which. Yeah.
And the CFO.
Yeah, I mean, who's perceiving your role? I mean, your general ethos, your job is to breaches, mitigate risk, etc. But if you're the board of directors, you ask, well, what is the role of CISO? I've been in this situation personally, and it's pass the buck to the CISO
Right.
when there's fraud.
Yes. So I'm going to cover that, like talking about the old game of cyber. But I agree. Like having the expectation that you're there to like stop breaches. No, once you have someone in security that's going to be there, no breaches are going to happen. And all you can do reasonably, I think, is reduce the likelihood, reduce it down, hopefully, so it's more manageable and it's not a nuclear option for the company. And to segue into what board of directors or others may think that you're on the chopping block for, let's say, a breach happens. So the old game of cyber or cybersecurity is essentially you have someone, I like to say, the commonly pick on head of product, and they have a product they launch out, and it's an awesome feature, and there's a security implication with it, and you're like, well, they're going to go off and launch it to production, and they're accountable for that feature, but there's a security piece of it, and then the security person, that's whomever is there, the organization, usually the one, the leadership part of it, is responsible if that risk comes up and it affects the business. So they're making choices on your behalf and not negotiating with you. That's the old game of cyber. So when a lot of incidents happen, people are trying to get things out of the door, and tends to be less of a conversation with security to launch those things. And that's the old game. It's clear as mud. Okay, and then the default metric kind of tied to the breaches is, if we haven't been breached, then we're good, right? That's all that matters. I want to stay out of the headlines. Another company breached. You have to do a year credit monitoring.
If you happen next week, then you're good. Yeah.
Yeah, right. So the whole point of this is some some folks that you might work with in different departments and different organizations may perceive these today still. So I just want to point that out. Okay, so hitting the wall. So this is a little bit of therapy and mind changing activities. So one of them is how do you make the boat go faster? Anyone heard that question?
Yeah.
So you know, you're part of a cruise ship, and you know everyone has a job and responsibility to make that sure that thing works and keep the lights on and operate great. And having the mentality of like, well, you know, blocking web filtering to like do a little browsing or whatever, is that gonna have some downstream effects where you're the opposite of no, and I'm just gonna lock everything down? Or am I going to allow it to slide and then do risk management approach to it as an example? And it's like the mindset of how can I help them sell XYZ? How does that tie to that? And just kind of shifting your thought process versus like, I want to lock everything down as much as possible so everything's secure. That's kind of like one of them. And then controlling. A lot of times kind of segueing into it, and a lot of these kind of overlap is we can get stressed out where we're allowing something to happen in a risk situation. And you're like, well, why aren't we locking it down? Why aren't they say no to that? You know, like, well, they made this decision to not do that those things. And you're like, well, what's in my control? What is in my power that I can focus on instead of focusing on things that may be petty or things that it takes an enormous amount of effort to tackle or control. So focusing on the things that you can in your environment is, I think, another way to look at it instead of getting overwhelmed pretty quickly. And then responsibility. So this could be triggering for some, accepting 100% responsibility. So this is more of like the analogy: if you're driving down the road and all of a sudden someone runs to the back of you from another car, and your thought immediately might be like, why did they run into me? I'm at a stoplight. This is silly. And you could easily point the fingers. It's so easy to do, right? But the responsibility piece is really, well, I decided to get in my car, go down the road, and I took that risk of potentially getting hit. And then kind of shifting your mind of like accountable for my actions, even though I might not be at fault, but I'm still there. And this could play out in your daily life and your careers in different ways. And I think it's just a way to like shift, like you're doing a mind hacking abilities to like stop focus on the negative. That's what a lot of this is around, because these cyber is unwillingly, and there's a lot of things going on. And you're like, well, how do I shift my mind so I'm not always in the negative? I need to be in the positive and forward thinking as much as possible. Goals, focus on what you want to get. So this is again like all interconnected of, you know, I just want to have a web application firewall. I just want to have you know, this next version of CrowdStrike because I don't want blue screens of deaths. Whatever it may be, it's like, okay, well, IT said that they don't want to deploy this because they don't want that to happen again, or whatever the case is. But if you're strategic about it, it says, I just want to deploy an endpoint or deploy this new generation of anti-malware software in the environment. How can I get to yes and working with them and slowly roll it out in a different and just really focus on it from that angle instead of like all the noise that kind of goes around it, and just work with and partner with IT and others. And then cake making process. So this is, in other words, baking in versus bolting on. So how do you become the flour in the cake making process versus the icing? The icing is known as the smoke and mirrors of like, oh, that's great, but there's no significance to it. I want some matter to it. How do I be a part of the process in the business instead of just the afterthought, essentially? And asking this question to doing your walkabouts across the different organizations is a way to like, okay, well, maybe I can include you in this meeting where they're doing this strategy or roadmap for this other business unit. And I could just be the fly on the wall, and I could just try to see where I could be adding value to their process or their initiative they're trying to roll out. It's pretty powerful. And then not playing the victim. It's so easy to go down the path of the negativity. Well, so and so doesn't work with me. They don't want to give me access to XYZ. What do I do? And this is more of like, oh, let me sit down with them, bring up the racy or something else like, okay, well, you have access to, I just want to have read-only access to this environment. I don't need anything write access, and try to get to having like a negotiation kind of skill set versus focusing on the things that you feel like it's happening to you and it's only to you. It's another mind shift change. Questions, comments so far?
Seems like a good philosophy for life.
Yeah, student of life. Yeah. So even I would have some of these like on a sticky notes and just kind of remind myself sometimes when things are getting really clustered. All right. Okay. So strategies to empower action. So, and this is no specific order. Business connections. So coming from a security leader, I'd like to partner heavily in legal and finance and privacy and others who may have a big stake in the organization and understand what makes them tick. Perform walkabouts, meaning like, how do you rate the success, or what does success look like in cybersecurity to them? So, like maybe you have to educate them, or maybe you have to tilt that a little bit, or maybe you're like, oh, if you had to run this organization, what would you be focusing on? Just asking them like open-ended questions to see where the thought process is, and then see like maybe that's your opportunity to bring value to them. And it's like when you're doing a check-ins, those sorts of things. So I find a lot of use in that, and especially if going through a situation where maybe it's a culture challenge you're having and you're trying to do, I don't know, security awareness training because everyone loves that, and someone's not taking the training. And yeah, you might have a policy that has some bite into it, like, well, you might have to disable your account until you get access or do the training. And using or leaning a little bit on your partners, such as legal, to say, oh, we need to do this because we have legal obligations from our contracts or our customers that we do training. So they could be good allies, I find. Kind of going back, well, to kind of segue into walkabouts is finding like what things that are troubling from them that you might be able to solve. Going to them and you're building up rapport with them. Like maybe there's some things you could do quickly that they would love it and see value in it. And then now you have someone more of on your side. Well, I know so and so, they get things done and they don't complain. And you know, now I don't have to deal with that issue that I had, whatever it may be. I think that can be very powerful to just continue to build one quick win, especially when you're new into a role. And then perspectives. So kind of, I think I skipped around a little bit and touched this on this. When you're having check-ins with others and understanding this, you could do this with your own team if you're a manager of sorts. It's just like, how would you run this program? If how long would it take to detect a breach? These open-ended questions I would ask them to see, well, maybe they have some good ideas and maybe they haven't talked about it and we need to bring it up. So now we can make it more into action. And then knowing the business. So knowing your cash cows of your organization, where the money is, if you're doing a lot of M&A activity, merging and acquisitions, maybe there's a business unit that's making a lot of money for the company. Maybe you should be focusing a lot of your security efforts in protecting that instead of something else over here. And it's easy to get distracted with that, but it's good to know what those are. So now you're having the conversation where it's like, well, you're not wrong. When you're having to that point, the aha moment, okay, so that would make sense. Now we're down to number games and the finance games of how do I help protect that and those threats that they brought up that maybe you're not aware of. And now you're gonna go back and do a special project to help them out. Okay, and trends the breaches. So I thought it'd be interesting to see if anyone could tell after I go through some of these cherry picked breaches that has happened back to 2013 for Target and how they got compromised from a third party clicking a link that's tied to the refrigerant or the HVAC vendor, and it could have been detected of having a good inventory of your vendors and the access they had that could have maybe I think we need to pull that access. They don't need to have access to the domain controllers or anything that's like more of like, well, that could be a big impact to the organization that could lead to a breach potentially. Yahoo employee clicked on a link, looking at your emails, which is I think one of the top things on business services that you should make sure you're doing everything you can. That's still pretty high up there on where compromises come from. And endpoint protections, Facebook, a third party that you rely on that had an exposed data set that was a misconfiguration of sorts, led to a breach, and then like a fallout breach on top of that. And using third party risk management, going back to like your tiers of managing those vendors and doing a lot of due diligence, maybe you're just like, well, wait, you can't have anything public. We need to watch your configuration management. What tools do you have in place to detect when a misconfiguration pops up so we can be proactive? Like, what are you doing with that? And then MGM from last year. This one was probably a little bit tougher of having impersonating of an employee to a third party vendor to say, hey, I need access to my account. I'm locked out. I got a new phone. Like, well, so you're looking for anti phishing, anti social engineering attacks of sorts, and your third party risk might have been able to detect that, or like, well, you can't give anyone access unless you follow these anti social engineering tactics to make it harder for someone to spoof that. Go ahead.
That's important. But if the vendor gets compromised and they send you an email, then it's kind of the thing. It's like that's what you email. And then it's always like the revolving door of third party.
Yeah, it's tough because it's like the human factor we want to trust, and then you have like banners like, oh, this is an external email coming in, like be careful who it is, and then next thing you know, they might have a link in there to click, like, oh, I need to do this, can you do this wire transfer or whatever it is, I need to do payroll that needs to be sent out to someone. It's tough, and you hope that you have enough of these layers that if you have the email, you have like those URLs are rewritten so they're scanned by your provider, your email filtering provider, that can slow it down, or your endpoint protection system where maybe if it's something clicked a link and maybe it stopped it from executing or whatever the case is, and you hope that you can stack all those things up as much as possible to reduce those. And then the training of like and simulations, going back to like say tabletop exercise, assume a third party was compromised and they had access to, they had like one of your company domain emails. What could they do? How could they do it? And what would they go after? Like having those conversations like, oh, well, maybe we should have them follow a process where they need to send, HR a note that they can't reset password without following the security questions that are unique or something to maybe reduce that chance. Hopefully that helps. So what's in common?
To some extent, they're all insider threats.
Yeah, unintentional insider threats, perhaps. Yes. Yeah. People. This is, if you look at it, and I kind of highlighted like in red, is these are your critical services and functions. Email, business service, right? Third party that had access to the customer data that they were housing in their environment. That's a critical vendor. That's a tier 1 vendor to me. And my point here is like, if we focused on those critical vendors that have the PII or data that could be nuclear almost, or making like a PR event, maybe we could reduce a lot of this. And then let's kind of back my data because I don't want to feel like I'm just having my opinion on this. Wild Ventures had this great report, which I have a link and anyone could look at it, talking about what types of data are included in the reporting to the board or anyone else. And it was interesting to see risk assessments is really high up there and how they convey something that they should be focused on. And the landscape of like, what threats are hitting us, what vulnerabilities we should be concerned about. And I was more focused on the risk assessments because I think that's a lot, the deep DPIAs or BIAs, that's a part of it, I feel. And I think this trend is where I would be at too. And as far as ROI on security stacks, a lot of folks, security leaders are doing, how can we reduce risks? I think it's big. Like, I think security leaders should be incentivized based on how many risks in your risk register you reduced this year. And how are you showing those trends versus just doing those shiny things out there? And I got that tool, I got this tool, it might help out this stakeholder, which is a piece of it, but not the full picture. And looking at reducing risk is, I think, the primary job if you can, or mitigate. Right. Let's see. Okay, that helps. So, okay.
Still coming on there. So you're saying the ultimate objective is to reduce the risk. I would suggest that it's probably more to manage and optimize the risk to within your appetite.
Yeah.
You don't want to reduce, if the risk is managed within appetite, and you don't spend any more on controls to reduce it further, then that's optimized. So I would want to reduce that. So I believe it's something about reducing risk, but not always accurate.
Yeah, it's like kind of going back to like, are we just trying to like be the opposite of no and just we want to mitigate, or is it like residual risk? It's at the balance. I agree to that.
Meaningful is.
Or around increasing risk in some cases.
Yeah.
I've been working with organisations, been working with Australian government. I have an interesting term that you'd like in relation to identifying what's important to business. They call it their crown jewels. Identify what your crown jewels are.
Yep.
And then obviously check those more things because they have the potential to impact the business. And I, in some instances, recommended drop-in controls because they were over-controlled. So the cost of mitigating the risk is more than the risk itself eventually. So there can be arguments that we don't have enough risk.
Yeah, I agree.
And it's interesting because cybersecurity risk is always seen as like the enemy, I guess. Because businesses like taking risk is what generates revenue most of the time. So it's interesting to find the balance between generating revenue versus take on 50 applications without a cost.
Optimize.
Yeah, you want to get to the point where if cost of currents cost to fix it, and then maybe you have enough numbers to like, oh well, I'm okay with that risk tolerance being a little bit higher on that item or whatever it may be.
Along those same points, one of the things that I think is missing here when we talk about risk, there's another 4 elements: transfer, eliminate.
Yes.
So those have to be described as part of the overall answer. But the other thing is, and the framework that comes to my mind, I know this is one, is Sherwood Applied Business Security Architecture. It's a fairly massive security architecture, balancing conceptual architecture, component architectures, et cetera, against functions, people, et cetera. And then that balances back to the same thing of whatever the goal of the organization is against its risk. To get to the point of saying, I'm gonna allow this risk to continue. So do we as cybersecurity people, to your comment, oh, every year I should be reducing risk? No. Every year I should be assessing my vulnerabilities based upon the risk structure. Some things I will just have to accept.
Right.
Either that or go back to paper and pencil.
Right.
So it's a nice chart. I don't disagree with it. Your sources are fine. But I think one of the things we have to come back to here is, from your opening, is how does this function against any organization, whether it's a hospital or business sector or anything of nature,
Or even startup.
or startup, even a startup, and this goes to Lisa's point, you know, who do you assign? Well, if they only got 3 people, then everybody's got 7 jobs, whether you got the, you know, the background or not. So I guess the thing was, these are nice numbers. And I don't disagree with where you got them. But I think it's missing a point is to really, how does it fit in the real world, our role as CISOs, ISs, whatever it might be. And it kind of goes to a sarcastic comment. Everybody here knows the acronym CIO. Now, career is over.
Yeah.
And you know what CISO stands for? Career is surely over. So this is what we face.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, so my thing here again is, and I'm trying to wrap it up into that, so I apologize for jumping the gun, but it's taking all of these things and understanding how do they apply to where we as CISOs fit in an organization.
Right.
And my job is to keep that organization as safe, again, we're back to your definition, as safe as possible under whatever security parameters, balancing risk against business needs. And a lot of times, yeah, they don't match. And my favorite one to pick on is the CFO. They just, you know, what you're brain on revenue. Here, we are brains on revenue because we don't produce anything.
Yeah.
Give me philosophy.
That's for the business enablement piece of it, right? 'Cause they depend on you to make sure that they can, you know, scale the cloud, right? Like they want to make sure that that's every, you know, that they're taking money that way, they're building more, you know, resources that are like increasing efficiency for the business, et cetera. And then of course they depend on you to make sure that they can do that safely. And I think like in all reality, it goes back to the like old what did you call it?
Old games of cyber.
Well, you know, about being strategic discussion, right? So just understand probably like have yearly event, like we're talking about say working with like legal and things like that, like all potentially for your auditor. Like as an auditor, I've had quite a number of CISOs come and talk to me like, hey, I know this is an issue. I know this is the biggest issue, but can you all make a note on, you know, that hey, this could be something, so that way there is something in here.
Yeah.
It never hurts.
And you'll have some business leaders that will say, I don't have any deficiencies in my findings. Like, well, actually, if you actually have one, it shows that this is where you have an improvement. It's almost like doing a performance eval. If you show that you're great all the time, how do you know where to improve? It's a good point. Yeah, I do cover a little bit to that, what you're all talking about with like, I don't think the solution is just reduction in risk. It's the balanced approach of, you know, like if the CFO wants to, hey, we need to cut more cost savings, IT and product can only go so far. Well, do we need backups? You're like, I mean, if you want to cut those costs, you could, but that's like, you know, the fundamentals, but you're going to take on more of that risk of like, if we have ransomware or someone does, you know, deletes all this data, what's going to happen? You're okay with that? And
You can get them to sign on.
Yeah.
To say,
Yeah.
I'm willing to accept.
Yeah, exactly.
Change.
Right,
Ooh, yes, yes.
Yeah.
right,
Let's see if I say, get cut cost in that area. Okay, well, it's gonna increase that risk to this way to be. But that's how I talk, you want to sign off on it. Your
Right.
sign off prices, say this.
I'm gonna cover,
The board.
oh yeah,
We have to search all the FCE.
yeah, I agree. Let's see what else. I know this is small, maybe I should go back here, about. Let's see. It's big here. Oh, okay, difficulties. Bigger. Okay, difficulties in report. Just talking about reporting, reporting up, reporting down, wherever. How do you know like the financial impact of a risk? And I think a lot of folks are struggling still to this, and I kind of makes sense because there's a lot of guessing going on, and then you try to like narrow it down as much, and then you use Fair Institute or other methods to try to hone in on how do you know what the cost of occurrence and cost to fix it is? And uh, I think that was what I was going to zoom in on, and how do we break that down?
Once you're securing dollars, everything's a lot of it.
Yeah.
It's, so it's like that, anybody would say that it's not that way. Oh, it should, any asset.
Yeah, you can. Yeah, you could figure out how much that server has, the PII, how much each record costs, and you could easily come up with some numbers to that.
The other thing again is, don't forget, it's the cost of your personnel. If something's down, I'm sitting there like this all day long. Just take my salary per hour.
Right.
Of course, in my case, it's only $1.98, and don't comment, Steve.
Yeah, you could easily just get a rough average of hourly wage and multiply that.
Yeah, I found that one's a tough sell. At the sea level, time is fluid, especially for the engineers of the world. What I see is quantitative and qualitative together is the way.
With the best success I've seen is memorandums with case studies attached to them, like this is what happened to this corporation. That's that,
Yep.
whatever.
Right? Opportunity costs, which we haven't really talked about today. I've used that very successfully as a lever. This thing goes down, this initiative, that initiative that you're working on, that you're being judged on, it's gonna get delayed 6 months. Are you willing to accept that?
If I can give it the same similar type of example, all you have to say is, you know, that RFP special proposal you're working on? I can't finish it, you're gonna miss the submission deadline. That'll get.
Mm. Yeah. Okay, how are we doing on time?
Another 10, 15 minutes.
Okay, I'll try to go a little faster. Okay, accelerating the journey. So
This is what happens when you start talking.
it's a balance.
Yeah.
Crown jewels. I've heard it several times already. It's critical data. Building the risk register. I know it's probably not as exciting, but I think it's definitely a tool that I use. I think we talked about.
Sign it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm gonna cover that too. I'll try to go fast here. Input from roadmap. So I think I mentioned in the beginning of the talk that how do you get a roadmap? Who creates it and what goes into it? And the risk register is a big piece of that, I think. Not all of it, piece of it. Metrics. How do you know what to manage if you don't know what you have? And what metrics are driving something that you want to try to achieve? The business input, like if you're doing a lot of M&A activity, do you have a emerging and acquisitions playbook? Is there, a lot of revenue, a lot of initiatives going on to support whatever company you bought or what have you? So that's a little bit of input too. The tool utilization. If you're using a tool that's 50%, such as sim is my favorite one. It's usually not really well done. There's a lot of moving parts and a lot of discipline it takes to actually do that right. And then the pillars of maturity. I've seen in a previous role, I've had like pillars of cloud security, IT security, compliance and privacy, even trust enablement, which is mostly sales enablement. And it's like, okay, if you get a rank what the maturity is, where would it be, and where do I need to improve on, and what matters most to the business? And in a startup, maybe it's trust enablement because you want to get more sales, you want to support them, and then there's a lot of trends with that CISO report also that it's a balance between managing risk, and then also enabling sales somehow. And then the narrative, how do you change everyone's thinking about cybersecurity of the office of no, or is it the necessary evil or the checkbox around to like, how can I enable you? There's just some things you need to do. I can help you there any way possible. And then paving the road with guardrails. There was a roundtable of sorts that I went to a couple months ago that was talking about AI. And some folks would say, well, I block the AI at my device or my firewall. And we don't know what's going on with that. We don't know how to solve for it. And it's like, is that the right answer? I don't think so. Because every person can find ways around it. Doesn't matter how good your stuff is, they'll find a way. So why would you want to go down that path, like the old way of, I think, security, to more about enabling? Okay, here's Microsoft Copilot. Here's like some tracking things we could do, or here's GPT Enterprise that there's some things we could have in house to kind of limit that exposure. And if you give them the tools, then they probably won't go off and do their own thing. They'll use what they have. That's the guardrails. Okay, modern game of cyber. Definitions of financial value, customer impact, PR. So this is basically if you have your matrix of critical risks to low risk, and you have defined of, well, a critical one is, I don't just throw out random numbers, 5 million in loss somewhere, somehow, or patients die, or those sorts of things. And you have, how do you define criticality? Well, and who's going to be involved with that? Well, that's going to be a call to the legal counsel. We might have attorney-client privilege. Oh, good to know. All those sorts of things. And you have agreements across the exec team of like, can you all sign off on this? Provide me input. Okay, great. Now we have something. So if we hit a certain threshold, I'm going to go to you and escalate this and hopefully resolve it. RACEs. Involving challenged stakeholders, those who are like may want to have job security and not want to give up something, or just don't play well with others. I think it's good to work with them to understand, where is their areas of focus and where yours are. And once it's clear and hopefully everyone's on the same page, then maybe they'll help, come around and support you. And then I also say in incident response too. Who makes that call if you get breached? Like, who says, "Oh, I need to sound alarms"? Should it be legal counsel? Should it be your compliance, privacy? Who? And understanding that, and RACI kind of starts to point that way wherever it may be. Risk register, calculating, documenting global risks, things that may not pertain to your environment, but something you might have to keep on your radar. And internal risks, starting to document those, however many you have, assigning the owners. Like it might be you initially, but like, okay, well, quickly I need to change this, or I need to find who that owner is. And then have continuous check-ins. I at a previous place, I would have bi-weekly check-ins with different stakeholders. Where are you at with this? Is that risk at this level still? When are you going to reduce that risk? What do you have on your initiatives? And hopefully you have that geared towards their plan for that year, that now you're going to, kind of work in tandem to reduce that risk instead of just you being in a silo to solve for it. And then going back to the quantitative versus qualitative aspects to like looking at your top risks, top 5, and that's the one that goes to the boardroom. Or if that, that person wants to make the risky decisions, say, hey, board, by the way, we have this new risk, so-and-so is associated with it, just let you know about it. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, you might not be popular for a while, but after a while, then they want to work with you instead of having a spotlight on you. Okay, conclusion, empowerment. Just changing your mindset, focus on the good. How do you reduce, how can we reduce and within reason what breaches are and the toolbar items that I've described? And just rethink, rewire. Go ahead.
That kind of aside of the risk calculation.
Yep.
I think from a practical perspective, what I found at the time, the two most important things about managing risk is consistency and calculation.
Yeah.
And prioritization. So you don't have to have perfect methodology, but as long as it's applied consistently, so you can have risks prioritized, then that's important.
You got me excited there because when I say documented risk calculation, which I might have glanced over, if you have a repeatable process, you can carry this into your vulnerability management process and start looking at CVEs and look at, is it exploitable? Is it vulnerable? Is it patchable? And all that kind of, if you repeat that, then you can get ahead of all these thousands of vulnerabilities. You can kind of do the same thing and pass audits too, on top of that.
Yeah, there's usually a little bit of subjectivity built into the risk calculation process. So putting some sort of overarching methodology in place to ensure consistency, it's not that hard, but very valuable.
Yeah, definitely. Totally agree. Good stuff. Understand, seek to understand, not to be right, observant, and play devil's advocate whenever you can. How to reach me? I'm on LinkedIn. I'm probably the only ace in the county does cyber. Or you can do my email, questions, comments, concerns.
And just real quick, we are recording this, so a copy of this will be available. On the slide. To make access to it.